In fact, I'll try to make a very conceptual presentation of what Anandamurthy tries to argue for and against. It's an argument for a certain position, and it's also an argument against a certain position. So I will I will try to present it in a conceptual form, and it's rather quite significant that we are doing it today, January 30th. We know the significance. In fact, the whole text was written just before he passed away in Kannada, and of course translated later, posthumously published. In fact, we must regard this text as the final testament. In fact, the word manifesto has been used, but I regard it as a testament by one of India's finest creative writers. In fact, we should also read this text as the culmination of an intellectual's moral journey, the final point of an intellectual's moral journey, which was always marked by a deep commitment to certain ethical values and principles that could not be contested by anybody. In fact, in the context of the violently turbulent phase that our culture and our society has entered, and this happened when Anandamurthy was during the final lap of his last run in life. Now, it was a matter of agony, of depression for Anandamurthy. Now, it was an experience of great pain and suffering. When all that a creative writer, as a socialist, as a public intellectual, had lived for, had represented, he lived to see the final days of his life when all these things were being demolished systematically. And therefore, it became necessary for Anandamurthy, because I've read several drafts of this in Kannada. In fact, I think this text should be seen as a glorious testimony to this writer's very sacred and dedicated commitment to a moral vision of humankind, located in India, but a commitment to humankind, and that transcends bigotry, hatred, vengeance, and animosity, especially animosity produced by communal attitudes, and communal attitudes fostered by extreme nationalist prejudices, attitudes, positions. So I think this text must be seen as a violent reaction. And when I use the word violent, I'm using it very cautiously, because it's very necessary to become passive, submissive when we deal with oppression, when we deal with cruelty. But I use the word violence to suggest this strength of character, fortitude, not to be put down by these oppressive forces. In fact, we must read this text, Hinduthva or Hind Swaraj, as part of a great ethical tradition. Now, this text, for me and for any sensitive reader, would not be an author text, but it's the text that comes from centuries of ethical practices, ethical principles. And also that particular tradition, this is crucial, this is very crucial, that tradition which believed that religion and politics were never antagonistic to each other. This tradition, the tradition I identify Anandamurti with, strongly asserts that our public and political life has to find a moral vision. And that moral vision comes through religious cosmologies. But a distinction has to be made here. And the crucial distinction is to see the difference between religion in very conventional, established terms, what we call establishment religion, and a religious vision that embraces a holistic vision of humankind and human welfare. Now, at a different level, this religious cosmological vision, this is very interesting, fully accommodates the best practices of all rationalist and secularist traditions. In fact, this religious tradition, this religious cosmology is against established, institutionalized religion. And in a very, very exalted sense, this religious cosmology that Anandamurti upholds actually embraces the best positions of rationalism and secularism. I think it requires great clarity on our part to understand that. And most myopic, narrow-minded rationalists and secularists do not understand this. That's another problem. The other point is, this text is, it appears to be, and it indeed is, a discussion on two figures and their texts, Gandhi and Savarkar, and their approaches, and these approaches as they come through their texts, especially Gandhi's text, Hind, Swaraj. But we need to extrapolate many ideas out of this. In fact, issues concerning religion, nationalism, and very crucially, issues concerning the corporate world. In fact, the single world economic order strongly advocated by global capitalism, and in the name of progress, development, growth, these are centrally important to the text. So it's wrong to assume that this book is all about Savarkar and Gandhi. Through Gandhi and Savarkar, the text turns to several other important aspects of the modern world. In fact, Hinduthva or Hind Swaraj is a text that draws from all sources. And when I say all sources, these are the sources that have shaped the fundamental values, basic principles of human civilization. So this text draws from religious, literary, and philosophical sources. And the struggle is to find an ethical alternative vision to what the world in general and India in particular is passing through. In fact, let us look at the paradigms that the text begins with. In fact, the paradigms that the text offers are all related to individual positions, individual choices. The text begins with reference to the existential, metaphysical crises of individuals. But when we talk of the existential crisis of an individual, the existential crisis of individuals, what we could perhaps call the metaphysical crisis that individuals face, we must also realize that it's impossible to separate personal, individual, existential, metaphysical questions. It's impossible to separate them from public, historical, social, cultural affairs. They two go together. In fact, there is no personal, individual, existential question that does not correlate with the problems of history. So, inquiries of individuals have larger political and social implications. And we cannot just dismiss them as mere personal probings. To understand Anandamurthy's text requires a very, very complex understanding of the great relationship, the organic relationship between metaphysical debates, spiritual anxieties, and ethically loaded political conflicts. So the spiritual questions of individuals, the metaphysical questions of individuals are also fundamentally very, very important political questions, political issues. And each has a bearing on the other. So this very, very complex relationship between what we call the personal, the private, the individual, and the public, this complex relationship has to be understood carefully. In fact, there are a couple of juxtapositions, and we need to understand why Anandamurthy operates through these juxtapositions. And each juxtaposition should be understood as a specific example, concrete specific example that comes from a very concrete specific situation. And therefore, Anandamurthy's text avoids simplifications, gross generalizations, and very trivial judgments. So it's with great sophistication that Anandamurthy builds his arguments. Now let's look at the examples. Let's look at the specific illustrations that Anandamurthy offers us. Anandamurthy begins with a reference to the Bible and the question that Job asks of God. Within the religious framework, Job raises ethical questions, not sparing God, because as somebody who had absolute faith in God, followed God's will, Job's lot was to suffer, to go through enormous misery. So Job asks certain questions. What we must recognize is that even within the religious framework, there are interrogations in relation to God. The will of God, the ways of God are questioned. And of course, we do know that Carl Jung, the great cultural psychologist, wrote a text calling Answer to Job. We must remember that text, but this is not the time to go into all these details. But Jung answers Job, and this gives another dimension to this issue. In fact, what is important is, this is crucial. Jung makes it clear that we must humanize God. To humanize God so that God understands the sufferings of human beings. God is not to be understood purely through abstract thought, through abstract reasoning. So if we grant God a human body, I will come to this towards the end of this presentation because we have another sense of God. Now, this is the anthropomorphic God, but God to get an ethical vision. How would God understand man's suffering, the suffering of human beings? Only if we grant a body, a physical body to God, would God understand man's suffering. In fact, one of the greatest Vachanakaras of the Kannada tradition, the 10th century poet, mystic, who belonged to the weaving community, what we call the Devanga community, Devara Dasimai. Devara Dasimai asks this question in the 10th century. And let's remember, he comes from the weaving community, the Devanga tradition. He says, oh God, if only you had a body, if we were to give you the attributes, physical attributes, would you know the sufferings of human beings? So to visualize God in human form, now this is anthropomorphism, is to raise ethical questions. It's not the anthropomorphism of right-wing fundamentalists, of religious fanatics. This is a different conception of God, which is also to mean that God too must abide by certain ethical questions. So the conversion of God, the granting of human form to God, is to raise certain fundamental questions. What does it mean? It only means that religion has to answer, that religion is obliged to answer certain questions that suffering human beings ask. So religion is not an institution, religion is not part of an establishment which, for reasons of power and authority, inflicts suffering on human beings. That it's not unmindful, it ought not to be unmindful of human suffering. Now, this is the reference to Job. The second example is an example that could be seen as a literary example or a mythological reference, and that comes from the Indian tradition, the reference to Satya Harishchandra. Of all the pain, of all the misery, of all the suffering that Satya Harishchandra undergoes. Now, this is an ethical question that people who have suffered, people who have been good, who have lived a pious life, sacred life, they have the right to question God. So we create a God who is obliged, ethically obliged to answer certain questions. Questions of whom? Questions of people who have faith in God, who have submitted themselves to the will of God. And when such people raise questions, these questions are indeed legitimate. So if a human being endorses God's ways, but suffers, but goes through misery, that human being has the right to question God. You see, this is the kind of religion, this is the kind of rational, secular religion that Anand Murthy's text deals with. And therefore, the idea of God, this is very important because we have a very different idea of God. The idea of God advocated, posited by fascists, by fanatics, right-wing fanatics, now is very different from this conception of God. The religious cosmology that Anand Murthy refers to, the religious cosmology that Anand Murthy draws from, is built on very, very supreme values of truth, justice, and equality. In fact, to go through Gandhi, from whom Anand Murthy draws a lot, to go through Tagore is also to recognize the fact that religion or the idea of God, the religious structure, the religious book, the holy book, whatever the holy book, or God, whatever the God one worships, whatever God one has faith in. Now, these two must really address the fundamental, the basic existential questions of human beings. And that is why you see a figure like Jesus Christ becomes important to Gandhi. So when we turn to Job, to Satya Harishchandra, through them, Anand Murthy's text, and of course through Gandhi, comes to the figure of Jesus Christ. These are the juxtapositions that Anand Murthy's text works out. The juxtapositions, very important, because even when we deal with religious cosmology, as I've been arguing, these cosmologies are based in rational, secular traditions. In fact, we must not recognize this religious tradition that Gandhi believed in, that Anand Murthy believed in, as antagonistic. In fact, it's not the binary opposite of rational and secular traditions. Look at the other example that Anand Murthy gives us. And here he turns to a literary text. And here begins the actual argument. The literary text that Anand Murthy turns to is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment, and the central figure, the protagonist of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov. It's a very, very complex argument. A philosophical tradition, a historical tradition, and a political tradition is foregrounded when Anandamurthy makes a reference to a literary text. Raskolnikov kills an old woman, accidentally murders her sister in the name of truth and justice, because the old woman is a money lender, a pest, a parasite, and therefore she has to be killed to cleanse society, to purify society. So it's an act of transgression which comes from another ethical principle. It is strange that murder is also based on another ethical principle. You see, these are the paradoxes with which we must understand this text. Raskolnikov says, if there is a pest, if there is a leech, if there is a louse, for the sake of humanity, in fact, this is the ethical tradition. I kill somebody to protect ethics. These are the paradoxes we must try to understand. And therefore, this is also, you see, part of a philosophical tradition inaugurated by Friedrich Nietzsche, and the idea of the Superman. If we turn to Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, his text, or his notion of the death of God, the birth of tragedy. In fact, it's an attempt to locate a world where you don't have Christ. It's the anti-Christ vision. Only because Nietzsche, and following Nietzsche, you have Raskolnikov. Now, both of them, one as a philosopher, the other as a fictional character, both of them recognize the point that in a godless world, we need to create a Superman, Übermensch, to cleanse this society. So the act of killing, the act of transgression is also an ethical act. This is very strange, very troubling, but this is this juxtaposition. And therefore, we must understand that certain very subversive ideas emerge in Anandamurthy's text. It is not a straight, simplistic text dealing with a very, very simplistic kind of moral scheme. It is not so at all. But let's also look at the other philosophical foundations of Anandamurthy's text. And when we look at the other philosophical foundations, we must realize that this was Anandamurthy's resistance to what he saw in 2014, the inauguration of the new regime. The coming of 2014 meant that India had entered a very turbulent, violent phase. And 2014 is important for Anandamurthy because it is the incarnation of two figures, Savarkar and his follower Godse. Let me repeat it. 2014 is a great turning point during our times, because when the new regime was inaugurated in 2014, it also meant a resurrection of the cult of Savarkar. And therefore, Savarkar becomes important, Godse becomes important. We'll go to Savarkar and Gandhi a little later. But let us look at Anandamurthy's major thesis. I will sum it up in the form of points. For 2014 is a great symbolic phase. What does it mean? One, that Jesus and Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhi had a notion of inner morality. Inner morality. The point is that they saw evil as located within oneself. This is crucial to our understanding of politics. Evil is not outside me. Evil is not outside the human being, but evil is within oneself. So this was the kind of politics, this was the kind of culture, society, ethical order that Jesus, Gandhi, Tagore believed in. And this is centrally important for Anantamurthy. And therefore, it's an inevitable duty, it's an imperative, ethical imperative for the human being to look at evil within oneself. 2014 is a turning point because you locate evil outside. You create an enemy. You create the notion of outsiders, that there are enemies who have come from outside. And the enemy is not within oneself, but the enemy is outside. So you will have to kill, destroy the enemy. This is the subversion of ethical politics. This is the destruction of ethical politics in India. And 2014 is centrally important because without remorse, without repentance, in an unapologetic manner, India began to identify its enemies, its outsiders, and the great shout, trumpeting, without any sense of shame, to say the outsiders shall be destroyed. The outsiders will have to be eradicated. You know, this is the reason why Anantamurthy made this statement, I do not wish to live in this India. He was made fun of, castigated. Some sent him tickets to go to Pakistan, ridiculed. And when he died, sweets were distributed, as sweets were distributed when Gandhi was killed. Crackers were burst. You had glorious fireworks to celebrate Anantamurthy's death. So you see, 2014, almost a decade now, marks the loss of this recognition that I must find evil within myself and not try to find evil outside. Next, Anantamurthy also notices 2014 as the loss of an important consciousness, and he borrows the term from the Buddhist tradition of the Mahasammata, by which we mean a state of consensus, where decisions are not imposed on society and on human beings, but decisions are made through consensus, public debates, where individuals and communities are consulted, consultation, discussion. So the arrival of 2014 also means for Gandhi the liquidation of public debate, discussion. So you have a pyramid-like structure, somebody sitting at the top, and everybody has to obey the will of that person. So the cult, the phase of cult building, celebrating culthood, shall we say, begins. And therefore, the destruction of the idea of, very central, the idea of the commons, the tradition of commons, the Mahasammata. Most important is, this was also the phase, of course, we have to go back to the 1990s, but 2014 is also a great consolidation of the phase of globalization. I repeat again, 1990, the 1990s, we saw the advent of globalization. 2014 is when you have official state sponsorship as far as the corporate world is concerned. So two forces converge. The force, the power, the authority of the corporate world, and the force, authority of the corporate world reinforces the power and authority of the political state. So we have entered the phase of religious nationalism. We have also entered the phase of corporate nationalism. So the last 10 years have seen the confluence of religious corporate nationalism. Now, this understanding of economics is central. It was central to Gandhi, and it again becomes central to Ananthamurthy. Now, turning to discourses, let's all look at the discourses of the last 10 years. The discourses on Indian politics. In fact, Ananthamurthy points out that the dominant tendency in Indian society, especially this middle class society, is, and of course, this started happening, these discourses started emerging just before the fall of the Babri Masjid. So it's a new kind of a political discourse. And just before the fall of the Babri Masjid, the fall of the Babri Masjid was an event, a particular event. But there were discourses surrounding that fall. There were discourses surrounding that particular event. And these discourses were to celebrate the Kshatriya Dharma, valor, aggression. And Kshatriya Guna was seen as central to Hindu society, Hindu Rashtra. In fact, even today we notice governance, good governance that promotes the welfare of human beings. Good governance is not our concern. It's not at all a criterion. Let's look at all our discourses, cultural discourses, political discourses. We notice that nobody is talking of bad governance or good governance. Governance is a very serious issue. Our lives are determined by the kind of governance we have. But we are talking of power. We are talking of authority. We are talking of national sovereignty, national security, and our prime concern is with nationalism. Nationalism, which of course is nothing other than the strong urge to build a singular Hindu Rashtra. And therefore for Ananthamurthy, it is not just enough to talk of the corporate world. It is not enough just to talk of our political state. We must also reflect on the state of society, what we could call our social consciousness, dominated by these values of a Kshatriya Dharma. Uninhibited, open, unapologetic, no remorse, no repentance, and to say, we shall exhibit our Kshatriya Dharma, because Kshatriya Dharma is essential in the face of an enemy, in the face of an outsider. You know, again, Ananthamurthy's thesis, I've made 3 points now. The 4th point is, this is very important. In fact, towards the end of his life, in Kannada, Ananthamurthy wrote a textbook called Matu Sota Bharata. Matu Sota Bharata, where the word has been lost, has been defeated, and by the word he means the truth. India has lost its word of truth, word of honor. The point here is Ananthamurthy's attack is equally against this society, the collapse of truly liberal values, and the silence, the oppressive silence of the middle class, including the middle class so-called liberal individual. And of course, the pathetic state of the so-called opposition parties, centrist or leftist parties, that no voice has emerged to contest the shout, the howl, the scream of those who talk of violent Hindu Rashtra. In fact, one of the most profound remarks that Ananthamurthy makes in this context is to hold each one of us. Each one of us is responsible. He says I'm saying the last 10 years, but Anandmurthy in 2014 said the last 10 years. So it makes it 20 years now in 2020. The loss of personal accountability. None of us holds oneself accountable to what's going on in the world. It's always the other. There is no attempt to own up personal responsibility. So India is going through a phase where we as members of a society and each one of us as an individual does not enter the realm of personal responsibility, the collapse of personal ethics. All these in Anandmurthy's opinion are reasons to look at the reincarnation of Savarkar. This is the new incarnation of Savarkar. And the rise of Savarkar is not an accident. The rise of Savarkar is central to the choices all of us have made. Therefore, the fall of the Babri Masjid, 2014, becomes central paradigms for Anandmurthy. And let me repeat, the rise of Savarkar, the resurrection of Savarkar is not accidental. In fact, Anandmurthy's argument is all of us, including the socialists. In fact, Anandmurthy is unsparing when it comes to the socialists. In fact, several times Anandmurthy remarked that the emergence of the right-wing government at the center is only because of the idiocy, stupidity, and eccentricities of the socialists. He did not spare his own dear friends Madhu Limaye and George Fernandez, but that's a different matter. Let me become a little particular. Anandmurthy refers to two texts by Savarkar, and we will look at how his argument progresses. One is Indian War of Independence, 1857. And the other is Essentials of Hinduthva that Savarkar wrote in 1921-1922. In fact, there is something astonishing here. In the first book, The Indian War of Independence, we notice a fairly inclusive Savarkar, in fact, who even attacks the British. In fact, that phase of Savarkar's life, we notice the willingness to see Hindus and Muslims as equal partners in the struggle for independence, liberation. In fact, that Savarkar is quite inclusive. But by the time we come to 1921-22, Essentials of Hinduthva, the divide begins, the dichotomy begins. And Savarkar talks of India as a Punya Bhumi, and it becomes a Punya Bhumi only for those who embrace, accept without any degree of questioning the Hindu consciousness. You have to be a Hindu. If you're not a Hindu, if you don't accept that Hinduthva, you will not regard India as a Punya Bhumi. Savarkar's argument is for Muslims, for Islam, India is not a Punya Bhumi. For Christians, India is not a Punya Bhumi. So they're not really people who respect India as a Punya Bhumi. The distinction begins. They do not recognize India as a Punya Bhumi. And so it becomes essential for Savarkar to assert that Hinduthva, the Hindu consciousness, is the only consciousness that recognizes India as Punya Bhumi. And you begin to notice that there is a rejection. When we come to 1921-22, there is a rejection of the inclusiveness of cultures. And what is central for Savarkar is the Kshatriya Dharma, masculinity. So masculinity is the only virtue, and this Hindu Rashtra, Hinduthva, must be built on the principles of Kshatriya Dharma. So a gendering has taken place. The nation is gendered. And it's also the attempt to give I mentioned it at the beginning, it's also the attempt to give a human face to God. As we have seen, Rama, Lord Rama, Kodanda Rama. Now, this human face of Rama is very different from the human face that Devara Dasimaya gave God, wanted God to have, or the human face that Jung and Job wanted God to have. This is not just anthropomorphism. This is the anthropocentric, where the human being becomes more important, but you use God to assert your self-importance. These are the distinctions. In fact, Savarkar argues, and this is the reference in Anandmurti's text, argues that it is the Hindu's natural right, invoking the principles of natural right, to be aggressive, to adopt aggressive postures, attitudes. And it is these aggressive postures and attitudes that are going to bring progress, development, and growth to a nation built on the vision of Hinduthva. This is rapine, which means you plunder, you loot, you expand. This is Western expansionism. And this is the point to remember, that Savarkar was indeed a secularist, as Jinnah was. You see, these are the contradictions that we need to understand. Those who were truly religious did not advocate violent, aggressive religious practice. Those who were secular, those who were rationalists, were the ones who talked of violence, bloodshed, and they were the ones who talked of two nations. This, of course, leads us to the story of partition. That's a different matter. And for these people, especially for Savarkar, and later on his disciple Godse, the inclusive nature, when Gandhi embraced Muslims, Islam, Christianity, identified himself with God. In fact, for Godse, smothered by the rhetoric of Savarkar. In fact, it was the rhetoric, Savarkar's rhetoric, that killed Godse's consciousness. Gandhi appeared to be anti-Hindu, pro-Pakistan, pro-Islam, pro-Muslims, and therefore Gandhi, if we read Godse's confessions, the statement that Godse made after assassinating Gandhi, he says, I may be hated for my act. People may hate me for my act, but posterity will remember me as somebody who killed Gandhi to save the nation. You see, already when we go back to 1948, when Godse assassinated Gandhi at a prayer meeting, falling at his feet, seeking his blessings and then shooting him down. This is the triumph of what I would call Savarkarism, to show that aggression, violence, and the Kshatra Guna, Kshatra Dharma are inevitable. These are of paramount importance. And therefore, the notion of a Punya Bhumi is not built on inclusivity, is not built on looking at oneself, is not built on introspection, self-examination, but is built on a certain imagined history, constructed history, where you create history, where you build history to say, India has gone through shame for centuries. India has experienced humiliation for centuries. So you even begin to manipulate history. You even begin to distort history. And therefore, historical texts come for a lot of distortion. The invocation of history is not to build bridges of friendship and love and affection, but to create memories, imagined experiences of hatred, animosity. Godse was not even touched by Gandhi's journey into Navakhali. In fact, Gandhi was trying to reassure Muslims, to heal. Gandhi was acting as a healer to heal the wounds. He did not celebrate independence staying in Delhi. For Gandhi to heal, to give reassurance to a community that was passing through great insecurity was an ethical act. But guided by Savarkar, Godse saw this as an anti-Hindu, anti-Indian, pro-Muslim, pro-Pakistani gesture. And the fact that Gandhi would turn to the Gospels, especially the Gospel according to Saint Matthew, Ignatius Loyola, or the others, was seen as a blot on the pure spirit of Hinduism. So for Ananthamurthy, now if we read the text carefully, it becomes very important to imagine an India, and this is what brought about all kinds of attacks on him. For Gandhi, a Jesus was centrally important. The compassion of Buddha was vitally important, and Anandamurthy openly declared that he did not want India to follow, to worship a Kodanda Rama, the warrior Rama. And this angered, the right-wing fellows who called him all kinds of names. So what is important for us as we read through Anandamurthy's text is to recognize the fact that for Ananthamurthy, and in the rich tradition of Gandhi, Tagore, vitally important for the future of India, if India is to have, to imagine, whether it's going to have or not is a different matter. If India is going to imagine a different future, its ethical imagination has to change. Its ethical consciousness will have to assert itself. And that ethical consciousness is built on the understanding that each religion has to evolve with and through other religions. The belief being, as it was Gandhi's belief, which is Anandamurthy's belief, that including the Hindu religion, no religion anywhere in the world can evolve on its own. The becoming of a religion is dependent on how much it borrows, gives, the transactions, the negotiations it establishes with other religions. And therefore, for Gandhi, the final choice for India will have to be between Savarkar and Gandhi, between Savarkar's notion of Hinduthva and Gandhi's notion of Hind Swaraj, and Gandhi's notion of Hind Swaraj, to go by Gandhi's statements. I will just give two statements. And this is the statement that continues to provoke all right-wing fascists. At one stage, Gandhi said, I cannot be a good Hindu unless I am a good Christian and a good Muslim at the same time. I cannot think of my purity as a Hindu unless I embrace the virtues, the values of Islam and Christianity. The second statement with which I shall end my presentation is when Gandhi modified his statement. When Gandhi began by saying God is truth, but towards the end of his life, Gandhi began saying truth is God. And therefore, there is no truth that is below God. In fact, all the gods of the world also have certain truths to uphold. And unless truths And these truths relate to inviolable principles of equality and justice. Truth, again, is not abstract. It's not an abstract thought. It has to be based on human existence. And the notion of truth is verifiable, easy verifiable, when we relate it to human existence, how humanity exists, what the challenges are for human beings, for individuals, and for communities. And therefore, for Gandhi to say, truth is God, is actually a violent contradiction of those people who impose upon us an idea of God, a humanized God. But that humanized God is powerful, militant, and induces in us this element of kshatra, the kshatra consciousness. And the kshatra consciousness cannot be legitimized without an enemy, without an opponent. So to protect your dharma, you have to create, recreate, re-recreate your enemy and your opponent. Now, these are the binaries that Anandamurti, in a very, very anguished manner, was trying to foreground us just before he passed away. The whole text was written when he was ill, very seriously ill, critically ill, but he managed to finish it. And that's why I began by saying it's a testament. It's not even an ideological manifesto. It's a testament of truth. And the text is a testimony to Anandamurti's position, commitment, dedicated commitment to an India built on love and compassion, and not built on the destructive, divisive values of a kshatra consciousness. Thank you so much. I shall stop here.